First of all, thanks very much for coming along, folks. It's great to recognize a few faces there, and it's good to see you again. Now, we've seen recently in the last couple of nights, Kenosha, Wisconsin has been under attack, right? So who's doing that? Well, I'll tell you exactly who's doing it. It's a group called the Freedom Road Socialist Organization. You can go to their website. It's called Fight Back News, and they're boasting on there about how they're involved and how this is their deal and this is an uprising. Freedom Road Socialist Organization is exactly the same group that started the riots after George Floyd was killed in Minneapolis. They started the riots in Jacksonville, in Tampa, in Tallahassee, Houston, Dallas, Los Angeles, Salt Lake City, Utah, Tucson, Arizona, and all the other places they have a presence. Also Miami as well. They've got about 5 branches in Florida. They're big here. Freedom Road Socialist Organization is a pro-Chinese Communist Party. They come out of the sort of student radical movement of the 1960s, the anti-Vietnam War protesters, the people who march for the Viet Cong. This is who they are. They're Maoist, they're pro-Chinese, very strong links to Colombians, to the Venezuelans, to the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, to Hezbollah. They are a terrorist communist organization. In 2010, 24 of them were their homes were raided by the FBI for material support for the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, Communist Party of the Philippines, and Hezbollah. But this is the problem. The FBI raided all their houses, but the Justice Department didn't go through with the prosecutions because when you investigate these people, they are tied to Democrats, especially Barack Obama. He was very close to some of them in Chicago. And so that's why the FBI doesn't dare to touch radicals. And that's why the FBI has got no clue as to what's going on in the country today. They haven't looked on Chinese goods. And the Xinhua news agency, the official agency of the Chinese government, said that our response is people's war. So what does that mean? Because a lot of people thought it meant, it meant they were going to put some tariffs on American goods, or they might, give American businesses operating in China a bit of a hard time. Now, people's war means just what it sounds like. When Mao took over China, he had a ragtag army against a professional nationalist army trained and backed by the United States. And he beat them after about a 12-year campaign. Yes, he got support from the Soviet Union, but that wasn't really the decisive factor. What People's War is this. It is every form of warfare except for direct military confrontation. Mao never fought the Chinese nationalists in open battle. He would flood their territory with counterfeit goods, flood their territory with drugs. He would propagandize amongst their troops. He would sabotage bridges. He would blow things up. He would do little guerrilla attacks. He would harry, but he'd never go into a direct battle because he would have got smashed. So only when the enemy had been virtually defeated, when the morale was rock bottom, when they were confined to the cities because Mao had taken over the countryside and he could starve them out, that's when Mao sent his soldiers in, when the enemy was already defeated. Well, People's War is now called irregular warfare as well. And it's been updated by the Chinese to include things like cyber attacks, supplying fentanyl to the Mexican drug lords or the precursors to fentanyl so they can kill 30,000 young Americans every year. It is biological war. It is, propaganda warfare through Hollywood, which they largely dominate now, through the American media, which has got a lot of Chinese influence in it. It's every form of warfare except, guns and bombs firing across the Pacific. So they're at war with us now, complete war. Now, I'll give you examples how this is playing out in America right now. Now, the COVID, right? So it came out of Wuhan, and there is evidence it was biologically created, probably out of the weapons laboratory, the biological weapons laboratories in Wuhan. Now, I cannot say definitively that it was deliberately released, but the timing of it would suggest that that is the case. Because, see, Trump had just given the Chinese leadership a good caning on trade. He had backed the Taiwanese anti-communist presidential candidate against the pro-China Taiwanese presidential candidate, and the good one won. He had also backed the protesters in Hong Kong. And this had meant the Chinese leadership was losing face. And what happens in China if you lose face and you're a leader? You will lose power not long after. So they declared People's War. And so in the January of this year, every year they held a big New Year celebration for a whole week and all over across China. And the Wuhan authorities this year said we should cancel this year because we might spread the COVID around the world. And the Chinese Communist Party said, no, you hold the celebrations. So all those thousands of Chinese who came back to China from Hong Kong, from Canada, from the United States, from Florida, from Texas, from New Zealand, Australia, all went to party up for a whole week in Wuhan, and then they went back to where they were living. And the virus was all over the world. Well, normally when we get a virus like this, or any kind of disease from cholera to diphtheria to typhoid to polio, the normal response is you quarantine the sick and everybody else takes precautions and goes about their business. We've never had a shutdown like this for any other disease in world history that I'm aware of. But we couldn't do it this time because the World Health Organization, which is run by Mr. Tedros, an Ethiopian Marxist-Leninist Maoist who loves China like a chocolate. Somebody's screen sharing again. Decided that no, we couldn't do the normal approach because there was evidence of asymptomatic transmission, meaning people were transmitting the disease without showing symptoms. So therefore, the normal approach wouldn't work. So we were told we were going to have to shut everything down. And the hysteria reached such a pitch that President Trump, who I'm sure was very opposed to this, decided to shut the economy down because he knew if he didn't, he would get blamed for every dead grandmother between now and the election. So he was forced into it. Now, Tucker Carlson had a guy on his show recently, Brian Dean Wright, a former CIA officer, a Democrat from Oregon. And Mr. Wright said this. He said, the Democrats are following the Chinese line over COVID. Shut it down, shut it down, shut it down. And he said, and Tucker said, why is this? Well, he said, some of the Democrats are useful idiots, but many of them, I got to believe, are paid Chinese agents. And I would name Dianne Feinstein as a probable one in that category. Adam Schiff is another probable in that category. Judy Chu is another probable. But anyway, so the Democrats and the Chinese both have the same interest: destroy President Trump. Because the Chinese know if they don't destroy Trump, he will destroy them. And the Democrats just hate Trump and they just want to destroy him. So if the longer they can keep the economy shut down, the worse Trump's chances of being re-elected are, or at least the more instability they can create in the economy and the country to steal the election if they need to. And that's what I'm going to talk about in a little bit, in a few minutes. The Chinese Communist Party released a letter in April 2nd signed by 230 world communist parties. This is how they transmit the party line. All the communist parties get the letter. This are the talking points you got to talk on. There's four main talking points. The first one was you can't blame China for the virus, because if you do, you're a racist. China is leading the charge in saving us from the virus. We should all be grateful to communist China. Third point, China can do this because it has a wonderful socialized healthcare system. Look at the mess they're making in America. You know, they don't have socialized healthcare. Fourth point, blame Trump, blame Trump, blame Trump, and blame Trump some more. Have you heard any of those talking points in your media or from the Democratic Party? It's all from communist China. That's who's calling the tune. So we got this situation going on. The Democrats want the economy shut down, and the Chinese want the economy shut down to destroy Trump. But the Chinese have an even more sinister purpose. When President Trump got elected, he understood that Barack Obama had virtually destroyed the US military. That's an exaggeration, but he'd done it huge damage. Morale was rock bottom. It was full of political generals. He'd cancelled weapon systems, cut military spending, offended our allies. It was in the toilet. President Trump, meanwhile, Russia and China, working together, were expanding their military build-up like crazy. Something we don't hear about, but it's going on all the time. So President Trump knew that we were facing war, the war that we would probably lose if he didn't quickly rebuild the US military, which he set about doing. You know, rebuilding morale, ending the transgender policy in the military, changing the rules of engagement so your troops can actually fight to win, and amping up the military budget. He can only do that on the back of a strong economy. Already 31 Democrats, led by the pro-Chinese communist Barbara Lee from California and the pro-terrorist communist Mark Pocan from Wisconsin, have written a letter to the Armed Services Committee demanding huge defense cuts in the next budget go-around. That is what this is all about. That's what the Green New Deal is all about, destroying the US military budget. And if they destroy the US military budget, Russia and China and Iran and Turkey and Hezbollah do whatever they want in this world. There is no opposition. This is a military attack on the United States, on your president, and the US military budget. That's what's at stake here. This is not economic downturn. This is actual physical survival of your country that this is all about. Now, we're just starting to raise our heads above the parapets, right? You know, Ron DeSantis is opening stuff up and restaurants are opening, then bang, we get 5 weeks of riots. This is Freedom Road Socialist Organization, as I've said, pro-Chinese communist. This is people's war. This is an insurrection directed by the Chinese in our territory. Why did President Trump close the Chinese consulate in Houston? Because they were helping the protesters. This is war on our territory. They're burning our cities. They're burning little towns in Wisconsin. So the other group, there are two groups behind this. The other group is Liberation Road. It used to be part of Freedom Road Socialist Organization, but they split off. For a while, they both had the same name, which was very confusing. But in March 2019, the second group changed its name to Liberation Road. You'll probably know their front group. They created this group back in 2014, which a few Americans have heard of by now. It's called Black Lives Matter. That is a complete front group for Liberation Road. It's a pro-Chinese operation, Maoist operation. And you got Republicans taking a knee to these people. You've got big companies giving them millions of dollars. This is Chinese, folks. You got two Chinese communist parties wrecking your cities and working with the Democrats to bring you down. Now, the other way the Chinese are working in your country, and this is directly relevant to exactly where you are. Now, well, you know that Virginia was a Republican state up till a few years ago, right? Very southern, hardcore Republican state. Flipped to Obama in 2008. Things have got worse ever since. Now, both senators, all the constitutional officers, most of the congressmen in both houses are Democrat controlled. It's a blue state. How did this happen? Just backtrack a little bit. If you were the Chinese leadership and you wanted to destroy this country, and you wanted to destroy this president, would you risk open warfare when you didn't have to, which is very expensive? Would you risk a multi-trillion-dollar trade war? Or would you spend a few $1 million backing insurrectionists in this country and people in this country who could flip states to make Trump lose? What would you do? Well, in Virginia, the reason Virginia is blue now is because of a group called New Virginia Majority. That is like an Acorn type group. They wear orange t-shirts. There's hundreds of them, and they go out signing up minority voters for the Democratic Party and getting them to the polls, just like Acorn used to do. Now, they take credit for flipping Virginia. One of their leaders wrote an op-ed in the New York Times boasting and taking credit that they did it. Now, New Virginia Majority works. They have signed up over 300,000 minority voters in Virginia in the last 10 years. Many Muslims. They work very close with the Muslim Brotherhood front groups in Virginia, extremely closely, and with the Iranian community in Virginia, which is pretty large. So in Northern Virginia particularly. They also work with Terry McAuliffe, the then governor of Virginia, to legalize 200,000 Virginia felons so they could vote. And they have been signing them up too. And they have flipped Virginia by doing that. Now, the reason they're so successful is they're using very sophisticated GMS mapping technology. This is computer-generated maps that can tell you the exact racial, ethnic composition of any area, the income level, the voting patterns of these areas, so they can micro-target their voting registration. So they can send Iranian volunteers into Iranian households. So they can send black volunteers into black households. So they can send Somali volunteers into Somali households. They've got it super sophisticated. Now, where do they get these maps from? Well, they have one of their comrades called Steve McClure, who did a geography degree at George Washington University about 10 years ago. And then he went to China, where he's been working out of the Wuhan University Geography Department ever since, generating maps to flip districts in Virginia. Talk about foreign interference. The Chinese flipped Virginia people. And most Virginia Republicans have no clue. They're doing exactly the same thing in North Carolina. They're using the black population there. They've got 5 of their comrades on the Durham, North Carolina City Council. They're using the black population of Durham to try and flip that state, which is why North Carolina now has a Democrat governor. They did the same thing in Kentucky with their group called Kentuckians for the Commonwealth, which is why Kentucky now has a Democrat governor. They're doing the same in Tennessee, and the same in Texas, and the same in Arizona. And they only have to flip 1 or 2 of those southern states, and Trump loses. And guess what? There's a group in Florida called New Florida majority. They also wear orange t-shirts, and they have signed up several 100,000 black voters and Latino voters in Florida, all under the nose of the Florida GOP. And they were also the people behind Andrew Gillum. Why did Andrew Gillum, the Maoist communist, very closely tied to Liberation Road, went to one of their training schools for a whole year? Why did Andrew Gillum get 40% extra, an increased Democrat vote in 2018? Because New Florida majority got it for him. I was at a Tea Party meeting in Gainesville in about 8 months before the primary, and Andrew Gillum was on 7%, and Gwen Graham was on 23%, and I told the people there that Andrew Gillum would be the candidate, and they all laughed. Who'd ever heard of Andrew Gillum, Mayor of Tallahassee? Gwen Graham was the daughter of a governor, had been a congresswoman herself, much more high profile. Well, guess what? Gillum won by about 34 to 31%, because what had happened, New Virginia majority and their allies were going into the Black and Latino communities of Orlando, Jacksonville, Fort Lauderdale, and Miami, people who are Democrats but don't normally vote and don't normally get polled. So their new strategy is the Democratic Party is ignoring the middle now. The Democratic Party is going full on for the progressive minorities. They know there are millions of Black and Latino voters and Muslim voters in the southern states who are Democrats but don't vote. So you run candidates of color and you sign these people up in the hundreds of thousands. All that money you used to spend on big TV ads to entice 2% of the people from the middle to go Democrat is now being spent on what they call low propensity voters in the southern states. And only the fact that Donald Trump endorsed Ron DeSantis instead of Adam Putnam, and DeSantis stuck it to Gillum and called him a socialist that he was, and actually raised the Republican vote by more than just enough to beat Gillum, is the reason you don't have a Marxist governor right now. The same scenario played out with Stacey Abrams in Georgia, another Liberation Road Marxist candidate. So, and guess what? Free Liberation Road was also the people behind the referendum in Florida in 2018 that gave 1.4 million felons the right to vote. Who do you think they're trying to sign up right now, people? Florida is on a knife edge. We've got a huge Trump support base in Florida, but you got to understand the left are out there right now trying to do an Andrew Gillum all over again, which is why they put Kamala Harris on the VP ticket. I predicted that 2 years ago as well, because Kamala Harris comes out of exactly the same stable, the same people, the same Maoists that backed her, the same Maoists that backed Gillum and Stacey Abrams and Barack Obama. It all goes back to the Rainbow Coalition of the 1980s with Jesse Jackson. That was a Maoist pro-Chinese communist operation. And the idea was you get all the minorities together, all the different colors of the rainbow, with the progressive whites, and you get a majority. Well, in those days, minorities were 12, 13, 15% of the population. Now they're pushing 35% of the population. So you add them with the progressive whites, you've actually got a majority for the left. And only the fact that most of those minorities don't vote in big numbers is what's kept us from going under the last few years. So that's where all the Democrat and communist money is going, into Florida, into Texas, into North Carolina, into Georgia. Trump's going to win Wisconsin. Trump's going to win Ohio. Where I worry about is Florida and Georgia. That's what North Carolina. That's what I'm worried about. So anybody who wants to live in a free country, you live right in the I-4 corridor, people, the most critical part of the most critical state in the most critical election in world history. And I don't want to put a big responsibility trip on you guys, but the fate of the world, the Western world depends on you, because it actually does. What happens in Orlando and the I-4 corridor will almost certainly determine who wins Florida, and who wins Florida will almost certainly determine who wins the presidential election. It is, and as Donald Trump Jr. said a few months ago, the 2020 election will be communism versus freedom. And he was not joking. You know, we've got to understand, if we lose this election, we don't sort of come back in 4 years or 8 years and have another go, because the Democrats are going to do what Hillary Clinton promised to do within 100 days of taking office. That is, legalize every single illegal immigrant in the country and give them citizenship and voting rights. That's 22 million people, folks, according to MIT. If that happens, we have lost Florida. We will lose Texas. We will lose North Carolina. We will lose Georgia. And we'll never get them back, because the Democrats will have this country in a permanent majority that can never be beaten. And they are communists now, folks. The Democratic Party is a communist party. They don't want to make us like France or Germany. They want to make us like Venezuela and Cuba. And then you have the Muslims in there as well, working with the Chinese. So, you know, they're also going to open up the country to refugee resettlement from the Middle East and completely swamp the conservative Christian Jewish voting base. That's the plan. So, you know, President Trump's election in 2016 was a miraculous event, which convinces me that God is not finished with this country yet. And we can absolutely win this election. But we need to understand that the left, doesn't matter if we win, the violence we've seen on the streets is only going to increase when we win, because they will have nothing left. So we have to get on top of that. And when we get on top of that, the left will be splintered and fractured and will be a much lower force for a long time to come. What we're seeing now is, if anybody was in Vietnam, you've heard the story of the Tet Offensive. You know, the American soldiers in '68 had the North Vietnamese beat. It was really only a matter of finishing them off. But they mounted this huge suicidal attack on every military base in South Vietnam. And they were slaughtered. But it played out in the media in this country as a huge victory for the Viet Cong. And that's when the American public turned away from the Vietnam War. It was a military defeat, but it was a psychological victory. Well, the left is doing their Tet Offensive now. They're throwing everything at you. They're throwing caution to the wind. They're exposing themselves for what they are, their corruption, their evil, their totalitarianism, in one final attempt to intimidate you and make you blink. Well, you blinked in 1968, folks, and you lost the war. Well, you can't blink this time. This is the time to double down, get everybody you've ever talked to the polls, get all your friends to the polls, all your relatives to the polls, because Florida could come down to those 500 hanging chads that happened in 2000. See, this is part of the Democrat plan. They lose the election, they've got a backup plan. With mail-in voting, a lot of states may not be able to declare for weeks, maybe months. They got to count and count and count millions of votes. And the election result may not be known for months, and it may go to the courts. And so what are Pennsylvania courts going to do with an undecided election? Democrat courts in a Democrat state. What are Oregon courts going to decide? What are Minnesota courts going to decide? So we have to win convincingly to ameliorate that, because if we win by a small margin and 6 states aren't called on election night, that could drag out for some time, which will be all sorts of instability. The stock market will sink like a rock. unemployment will go up, the left will go crazy, and it all might be decided in the courts. Can you think of a greater recipe for instability and disaster than that? And then if the Democrats still have the House, on January the 20th, Nancy Pelosi becomes president. How's that for a positive scenario? So, yeah, it's not good, is it? So, look, I've painted a pretty bleak scenario, but look, the reality is, I want you off you've got to be off your backsides. If you're not involved in voter registration or phone banking now, you've got to be. I'm in the I-4 corridor. This is where I live for this very reason, because I'm going out to every Tea Party meeting I can, every Republican club I can, and drilling this message in, because we have probably 3 million Christians in this state who don't even vote. We got to get them all to the polls, because it could come down to a very tight race, and we want to win by 10, 15%, not win by 1%, because that will be contested in the courts. Hillary Clinton's telling Joe Biden, don't concede, do not concede. So this is not going to be decided on election night, folks. That's what I'm saying. The insurrection doesn't end when Trump wins again. He either loses and we're in big trouble, he wins by a small margin, we're in big trouble, or he wins by a lot and we get lots of riots. But at least we'll be in the driver's seat, and at least we know who the bad guys are, and at least we can get on top of it. But this is an attempt by the Chinese, the Iranians, and the Venezuelans and the Russians to finish this country off. It's not going to end the day Trump gets re-elected. But we have to get him re-elected to have any chance of going forward. Trump said recently, Joe Biden would sell this country to China. Well, he's got a Maoist vice president who would actually help him do that. So I'll call it quits there, I think. I don't know if we have time for questions, but I think I've laid it on the line pretty harshly, folks. But the reality is, God gave us this president. God gave us another chance. So I don't think he wants to see this country lost. And if we dig deep, if we try hard, I think we'll be smiled on again. But if we give this God-given opportunity up and don't take it seriously, like the Old Testament, a lot of times the Israelites got a second chance, right? God says, you're not doing right. You better get yourself sorted out. I'll give you another shot. Well, how many times did they get a third chance? So we're in our second chance. We've been given that, and we better darn well use it. And you guys are living in the most critical part of the state, in the most critical area, in the most critical election. I think there's only one thing that you got to look at your children and your grandchildren, and you got to think, what role can I play between now and the election? How many people can I sign up? How many doors can I knock on? How many people can I phone bank? And it's all the machinery is all there ready for you to go. How many checks can I write out? What can I do to get, how many meetings can I hold? What can I do to get more people to the polls in Orlando or Kissimmee or wherever you live? Because we have the majority in the state, but the left has the organization. So we got to get our people to the polls.